Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. Okay, so I want to continue discussing reviving Catholic culture and ways in which we can do this. I mentioned last time that one of the first things that I believe we need to do is revitalize that which people see the most in church, that which they most identify with their experience of church, and that would be the liturgy. We need to revive the liturgy so that it shows people what we believe. So we believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the most holy Eucharist, right? So our liturgy should make that clear to people. And not just what the priest does, but how the people interact during the liturgy should depict what we believe. There's a great Latin phrase that has been in use for well over a millennia within the church. I think it actually started with Saint Benedict back in the 5th century, I think. And the phrase is lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. So, meaning the law of prayer, the law of belief, the law of life. Okay, and the order of these is important because what it's conveying here is that how we pray affects how we believe, which affects how we live. And this is actually very much along the lines of the Franciscan School of Theology, which we've had a fair amount of discussions of throughout the episodes of this podcast, and also the Augustinian School of Theology, which puts the heart before the mind, because you need to, once you can pray and you form that relationship, right, then you get to know that whom you have a relationship with. And what is the primary form of prayer in the church? Well, the liturgy, the divine liturgy, the Mass. If our prayer shows people what to believe, then what they believe will be enacted in their life. And I think it's fair to say we can see it, at least in America, and in Western Europe, for that matter. The liturgical reforms after Vatican II have not only borne no fruit, it's borne negative fruit. If the tree had 3 apples on it before, it now has 1. Okay, not only did we not gain fruit, we lost fruit. Okay, our mass attendance has diminished incredibly. The amount of people that believe what the church teaches has diminished incredibly. I mean, it's just, look at what's happening. Look at what has happened. And people will try to say that, it's the liturgy. It's not the most important thing. What's most important is what we do for people, right? What we do for people, or your own personal prayer life. That's the most important thing. But I'm sorry, if just what we do for people is what's important, I don't even have to be a believer in God to do that. I can be a social worker who's been an atheist their entire life, and I can do good works for people. That means nothing without personal prayer. And then personal prayer on its own, I mean, I could just be one of those Christians who say, like, what is it? Like, I don't need religion. I have Jesus. Is kind of what they say. And what they mean by religion is like organized religion. Like, I don't need to go to church every Sunday because I have Jesus. I have my relationship with Jesus. Well, that is clearly a misinterpretation of what salvation history is all about. Clearly. So if it's not mainly about what we do for people, and it's also not mainly about my own personal prayer life, what's the main thing that we're doing here? It's the communal worship of God, and that is what has been consistent throughout all of salvation history. I've talked about this a little before, but people think, the Old Testament, that was all about the liturgy and the communal worship. Like, they didn't have personal relationship with God back then. That's what people will say sometimes, or if they don't say it, that's how they live. And then they say, well, with Jesus, Jesus made it all about, like, now I can have a personal relationship with God. And, that's the main difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, is that I can now have a personal relationship with God. That's a bunch of baloney. Just look at the scriptures. The prophets had incredibly deep relationships, personal relationships with God. And again, I've discussed this more in depth in the past. You can go back to those episodes and listen to them for a fuller explanation of what I mean here. There are distinctions between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Of course, they're two different things. The Old Covenant, people, like, the gates of heaven weren't open yet, basically, is a very simple way of saying it. The New Covenant, they are, okay? But that doesn't mean that people couldn't have a personal relationship with God in the Old Covenant. So if that's not the defining factor of what Christianity is, that's been contiguous throughout all of salvation history. You know what else has been contiguous throughout all of salvation history? Liturgy, where our personal relationship with God is manifested in a communal way, or actually, I would argue it's the other way around. That our personal prayer is a manifestation of our communal prayer. That we learn everything that we've learned. We learn it from other people, primarily our parents. Next, the rest of our family, siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles, family, friends, those sorts of things. And then you have, like, the larger community among that. We don't learn in a vacuum. In the same way, our relationship with God, we don't learn it by first starting off in a personal relationship with God. We learn it through community and throughout salvation history. This is just a fact of history, is that from the beginning, liturgical worship, and particularly sacrificial liturgical worship, has been the mode in which the church, the ecclesia, the community, has operated. So I don't know where we get this idea. I mean, it's come from, like, third generation Protestants, and then for some reason the Catholic Church after Vatican II, much of the Catholic Church, obviously not the whole Catholic Church, but much of the Catholic Church took this idea up that our communal worship is not the most important thing. That what's most important is my personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm sorry, it's not. You learn your personal relationship with Jesus Christ from how we worship community, not the other way around. And no wonder people have so much trouble nowadays forming a prayer life, because they have no examples of it. If we're not teaching them how to form a proper prayer life and how to form proper worship when they come to church on Sunday, in regards to the spiritual life, we learn how to pray from the liturgy. That's the primary mode in how we learn how to pray. Just like how we learn everything else we learn it through the community that we're in. We learn prayer through the communal worship. We learn our personal prayer through our communal prayer. And our communal prayer needs to be consistent with what we believe. If we believe that Jesus Christ is truly and really present in the Eucharist, then we need to act like it during the liturgy. And if we act like it during the liturgy, then people will act like it in their personal prayer lives. This is how we bring about revival. This is how we bring about revival. We do not need a reformation. The church does not need a reformation. The church needs a revival. And the difference there is reformations come from where somebody breaks away and starts their own thing. A revival is from the ground up within the community, transforming it from within. I'm begging you, my brothers and sisters, please, we need to understand how important the revival of the liturgy is. If you want people to understand better, if you want people to be better catechized, the best way to do it, the most organic way to do it, is by a revival of the liturgy. Now, what are some very practical ways that we can do this? And I'm going to give some principles here. The first main principle would be what Pope Benedict XVI calls the hermeneutic of continuity. Don't get caught up in the fancy word. Hermeneutic is basically a synonym for interpretation. So how we interpret the liturgy of today should have continuity, should be contiguous with the liturgy throughout all the ages of the Church. So, you go back, you look at the history of the liturgy throughout the Church's life. There have been certain times when there have been some fairly major changes, like in the context, in their cultural context. There have been some fairly major changes that have happened to the liturgy throughout the last 2,000 years. But none has compared to the changes that occurred after Vatican II. And I'm not saying that this was not what was called for by the Council. It is how the Council was implemented. I'm not a denier of Vatican II. I fully support everything that the documents of Vatican II have promulgated, have put forth. But the implementation of those things, I would argue the implementation was contrary to what the Council requested and envisioned. There should be if we're trying to figure out how the liturgy should be today, it should look mostly like how it's looked in the past. Anything. Here's what I would argue. What were the main points of revival that were put forth by the Second Vatican Council? I would argue, and this is from the document Sacrosanctum Concillium, which is the document on the liturgy that the Council promulgated. And I would say one of the first things that the Council desired in this revival of the liturgy was a more of a participation by the laity. So, more of a participation by the laity. Also, one of the main things that they desired was more of an incorporation of the vernacular language within the liturgy. And let's see, what else? I don't know. Maybe those are the two main things. I'm trying to think. Yeah, let's say for now those are the two main things. If anybody has any more to add, I will try to incorporate those later into another episode. But let's talk about these two in particular, and how I could see them being implemented in a way that is contiguous with the Church's liturgy before the Council. Okay, so greater participation by the laity. That does not mean that every layperson now needs an active role in the liturgy, like doing something within the sanctuary. That's clearly not what the Council envisioned, because then there would be no people left in the pews. All right. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be a lector, that everybody has to be an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. It doesn't mean that we need extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion at every Mass. It also doesn't mean that if the ordinary members are there, the ordinary ministers are there, like the priest, the deacon, the bishop, that if we have enough of those, we should not be using extraordinary ministers. Same with lectors. If we have instituted lectors, people that have actually hold the office of lector within the Church, which still exists. It's not a minor order anymore, but it is an office in the Church. If we have those people that are instituted as lectors, they should be primary. So if there's somebody at Mass who is an instituted lector, they should be the one reading over someone that is not. And I think in most contexts today, instituted lectors are active seminarians or people that used to be seminarians, because I think it's your third year of theological education that you're instituted as a lector in most dioceses. And then also, if we have an instituted acolyte, he should also be serving as an MC, directing the altar boys where they need to go. That's another very important thing I would argue for continuity is, and just for the sake of vocations, is we need to make it a priority that boys are the ones that are chosen to be altar servers over girls. Now you might say, oh, Parker, that's sexist. No, it's not. No, it's not. In the same way that it's not sexist that we have an all-male clergy. It is not sexist. What it does do is it gives young boys an opportunity to get a feel for what it would be like to be a priest or a member of the clergy. It gives them an introduction to that. And we need to get rid of all these, like, sometimes they'll put servers in little albs, the little white garments that they're wearing, and like I have no idea where that ever came from, why we started using albs for them over like a cassock and surplice. When they wear the albs, I'm sorry, they just look like little marshmallows, like walking around the altar. They do, and like it just, I don't know how to pinpoint it. And if people disagree on me with this, that's fine. Maybe I'll figure out a way where I can pinpoint this and why, like, it just rubs me the wrong way. And why it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I mean, there's a lot of parishes moving back to having their servers in a cassock and an album. Also, I mean, here's one thing: is the priests, if they're doing a liturgical function where they're not like fully vested in their chasuble and everything, then they're going to be wearing a cassock and an album, or a cassock and a surplice. Sorry. So the cassock is right. It's the black long gown type thing, And a surplice is the white like t-shirt looking thing, but it's like a very large t-shirt. That's kind of the best way I can describe it. And they're white, so you have this like white and black, garment going on, right? When you're wearing a cassock and a surplice, and that's what priests wear when they're not fully clothed for the liturgy. If they're not fully, if they're not the ones saying mass. If a priest is just present at mass, but they're not like saying mass, then they're going to be wearing a cassock and a surplice. And in the same way, we should give our young boys, we should clothe them in the same way so that they're actually like given a feel of what it would be like to be a priest. I mean, we wonder why we've been struggling with vocations, and it's that our liturgies have been watered down so much to the point where like the priest, in many ways in which the liturgy is now set, the priest seems quite demasculated, I would argue. When the liturgy becomes more about the community than the worship of God, the priest ends up being demasculated. And that is not at all attractive to a young man or a boy. That is not at all attractive and enticing to him to become a priest, to emulate that in his own life. Okay? Men are ordered towards taking action, not towards... Men are not ordered towards being placated, and men are also not ordered towards reception. Now, this doesn't mean that men aren't receptive, and it doesn't mean that women aren't ordered towards action. It's an emphasis thing here. Men are more ordered towards action. Women are more ordered towards reception. This is just human nature. This is human nature, okay? So, in the liturgy, when the liturgy is seen first and foremost as a sacrifice in worship to God, the priest then takes an active role, and the action there is the sacrifice being completed, okay? And there has been no instance in salvation history where sacrifice has not been the worship. There has been no instance. It doesn't exist where we have worship without sacrifice. Now, it's not we don't sacrifice animals anymore, and it's not a new sacrifice. It's a participation in the one ultimate eternal sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, right? So, and this is why the Church has made the sacrificial aspect of the liturgy the primary aspect for the duration of the time that the Church has existed. And this is also a reason why men are chosen to be members of the clergy, because the liturgy, which is the primary function of the clergy, is an active sacrificial worship. It's an active sacrificial worship. And as soon as we make it more about community, this horizontal thing where we're just la-di-da-di-da, like yippee-ki-yay, we're a community together, as soon as that happens, it demasculates the priest, because he is no longer necessary. If the liturgy is primarily about the community and not about the worship and the sacrificial worship of God, then why do we have a priest? We can just go down to the Protestant church down the street, eat donuts and coffee while we're talking about Jesus and Scripture. I mean, if we don't have sacrifice, we lose our identity. If we don't have the Mass as sacrificial worship, we lose our identity. No wonder Catholics, when they leave the church, they go to the Pentecostals or the Evangelicals, because that's basically what we're telling them to do by our liturgy, because they're more focused on community, oftentimes, than they are on sacrificial worship. No wonder we have no vocations, and priests oftentimes feel unfulfilled, because the primary action, the primary duty of theirs, which is to offer sacrificial worship in the liturgy, is not shown to be the primary aspect of that sacrificial worship. So it's like we're saying, we're having sacrificial worship here, but it's more about the community. It's not as much about the sacrificial worship. That's just a secondary thing. Then it's contradictory to each other. You can't have sacrificial worship that's mostly about community. So I got on a rant there. We were talking about altar boys a little bit, and why I think that it's very important to have altar boys and not have altar girls. I think it's very important to train girls in being something like sacristans, because that is much more ordered towards the nature of a woman. Is like being a sacristan is it's a very nurturing kind of a job. You're nurturing so that the priest can then go forward and offer the active sacrificial worship. Boy. So that's kind of the active participation thing in my thoughts about that. So that was the first aspect about Vatican II, and I gave some reflections there on how we can better do that. Other things to make truly active participation happen, and I think how we make active participation happen is primarily by restoring the active participation as the primary mode of the priest. And that would involve, I would argue, having our worship posture, the worship posture of the priest, be an ad orientem posture, where he is facing with the people, the same direction as the people. So everyone is facing towards the same direction, aka towards God, and it's one worship. Because when the priest is facing the people, when it's ad populum, towards the people, the liturgy, sorry, there's a guy blaring music out here. 1 second.
Okay, so when the liturgy is when it's done in the posture ad populum, where the priest faces the people and the people face the priest, you lose that posture of worship. It becomes a posture of a meal, which is what it was intended to be, and that's understandable. But we have to ask ourselves, again, what is the purpose of liturgy? Is it a meal where, meals are really purely human actions. They're between human beings. It's a horizontal kind of a social gathering. But worship is a vertical relationship. It's not just a social gathering. It's a social gathering that is lifted up. It is sanctified and divinized, and it is raised up for the glory of God. A meal, on the other hand, is it is a very important aspect of communal life, but a meal is it involves conversation between different people. A meal is not worship. It's not. If the primary function of the liturgy is to be a meal, then we have reduced it to a mainly horizontal relationship. And to a real extent, the Mass, it is a meal, insofar as, the first Mass was the Last Supper and all these sorts of things, right? But what does Jesus say at the Last Supper? He says, this is my body, which is given up for you. This is my blood, which is given up for you. The meal is the symbolic portion. So what's the real part of it? The meal symbolizes something. And what that something it symbolizes is the sacrifice Sorry, my dogs are barking. Man, it's like I can't win tonight with this episode. A meal, the Last Supper symbolizes something. And what it symbolizes is the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And what is the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross? It is the ultimate act of worship. It is where the God-man, the incarnate second person of the Blessed Trinity, offers his humanity and his divinity. And in that, he offers all of humanity up with him to the Father. It is the ultimate source of sacrifice and source of worship. All of the Old Testament sacrifices and worship pointed towards that cross, and all of our worship points back to it, or rather brings the cross forward to us today. So, yes, the liturgy is a meal, but that's the symbolic portion of it. What the Mass is, what the liturgy is in reality, is a representation of the ultimate act of worship, and that is the sacrifice of Jesus upon the cross at Calvary. So, yeah, I hope this is helpful for you guys. I guess the other thing that I referenced was the vernacular. And I think next time it will be important to talk about that. So we talked about the active participation issue and what that would actually look like in continuity with the church's practice throughout history. Okay, that the liturgy is not it's not primarily a meal. The meal symbolizes something, and what the meal symbolizes is the sacrifice. So the Eucharist, the liturgy, is primarily an action of sacrifice. And the active participation that is done by the priest, I think is quite obvious, but then the active participation of the laity is not an active participation that emphasizes the communal aspect as much. It does that, but primarily it should emphasize the aspect of worship. So the laity should be offering themselves up with the priest spiritually, offering all of their sacrifices up with the priest in the one holy sacrifice. That is what true, authentic participation and active participation of the laity should be, is when we enter into the deep mystical mystery that is the eternal event of the cross being made present to us in the liturgy. That is what active participation has always meant and will always mean. And that's how, if we want to get back to becoming an authentically Catholic, holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, we need to recover that holy Catholic and Apostolic notion of active participation. Okay. Next time, we'll talk a little more about what it means for the vernacular and how that can be incorporated in continuity with the Church's tradition throughout the ages. Thank you. Real quick, please feel free to subscribe to any of my podcasts on any of the podcast players. Find me on YouTube. Please subscribe. Like me on Facebook, like the Catholicism Card channel on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're all there. Catholicism Card. And then I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support what I do at this podcast and this YouTube channel. And you can also support us on Anchor.fm. There's a support button there you click on. I also have links to all this on my website's support page at www.catholicisminthecar.com.